PowerApps developers are used to building apps that look like this when you can build apps that look like this. And to show this is not a mock-up, let's check it out. We have a simple inventory management app that shows the top rated product categories. Selecting a category filters the product view to show the top rated product in that category. You can also view all records for both the product table and the product category table.
Oh my.
In our last video, we learned how to build modern galleries, and many of you asked to make a video on how I built the UI. We will learn that and more in this video. We will learn how to create custom header components, mobile menu bars, custom buttons, stacking galleries, custom search bars, and the updated way to create rounded backgrounds and drop shadows.
Sensational.
And the best part about all this, it was built using basic controls only, so no HTML controls.
Yes, 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 yes.
But as you've noticed, we use some custom SVGs in the build.
No, no, no.
Not to worry, if you haven't watched any of my previous videos, I will be showing you the most efficient way to handle SVGs in your app. With that being said, let's get into the video. Once in PowerApps Studio, the first thing I like to do is to set up my app colors in the apps on start property and store them in variables so I can use them wherever I need it, and so I'll have one point of change. And besides, it's much easier to type primary color rather than typing RGBA 1452055. Anyway, you get the point.
Lazy.
After every change, don't forget to run the onStart function so you can get the latest changes. The next thing I do is to select a theme that matches my design idea the most. Selecting the right theme can help you reduce development time. For instance, if you're making an app where the main color is reddish, you select the red theme, and by default, all colored controls will have a reddish undertone. This means you won't have to change stuff like hoverfill or border color for each of these controls. However, if you are going for an app where the main color is greenish, you don't select blue because you have to change the colors for every single control. I know the next question is, what if my color isn't available or there isn't one similar to it? Maybe you're using some outlandish color like turquoise or, I don't know, sky jungle pink. In that case, just select any of the light themes because you have to set your colors manually anyway.
My disappointment is immeasurable.
In our case, we will just go for the light theme. The next thing I do is to add in any images I plan to use on my app. Yeah, I know you don't want blurry images, but that doesn't mean you should be adding those HD, ultra-realistic, hyper-resolution images to your app.
Who's gonna stop me?
Those images have a high file size, and then you go ahead and add 10 of them. That just slows your app performance. I prefer to keep most of my images below 1 MB and maximum 2 MB. There are a lot of free image optimizers online, so you just have to find that sweet spot between image quality and size. In our case, we are just going to use 2 images, one for the homepage background and one for the header. The next thing I do is to set up my custom SVG management. I only do this if I plan to add in custom SVGs in my app. The most efficient way to do this is to have one point of call for all your SVG icons. As I've said in my previous videos, I get most of my SVGs from icons.getbootstrap.com, as they have a huge variety of icons, almost 2,000 as at the point of recording. All you need to do is to search for your desired icon, scroll down to the copy HTML part of the SVG code. Next, paste it in any text editor of your choice. It can be Notepad or any code editor. Then you replace the double quotes with single quotes. The shortcut for the find and replace functionality on Windows is Ctrl H. For Mac users, I assume it should be Command H. Once that is done, you want to copy it and store it in a collection in the app's on start property. The collection schema is simply the icon name and the icon data. Set the name to whatever you want and then paste the icon data we copied earlier. Then you do this for as many SVG icons are needed in your app. To add it to your screen, just add an image control and then in the image property, paste this code. The first part is static and the second part is where we add in our icon data. So we look up to our custom icons collection and then where icon name is equal to our icon name and then add in the icon data. By default, all Bootstrap icons are black, but we can customize it however we want quite easily. On the Bootstrap website, you will notice that each SVG has a fill property which is set to current color. All we need to do is to replace that with whatever color we need. So in our case, we use the substitute function, and then we can add any color by using the literal name or an RGBA code. In our case, since we had set up all the app colors, we can just use in our variable. This way, we can have one icon and multiple colors. We can even add conditions. For example, if this item is selected, be blue. If not, be sky jungle pink.
Hey, that's pretty good.
So this part is coming in post-production. But basically, Microsoft recently put out a new patch that now allows users to upload an SVG file like a normal image file.
You're joking.
I'm not exactly sure when this patch was released because I recorded this video some weeks ago. Well, I haven't released it yet.
Stupid guy.
So let's check it out. All you need to do is to click upload, select your SVG file, and that's it. To add it to your app, just reference it normally, and that's all. You can even use them as background images, and they will be HD regardless of size because they are vector graphics. So that doesn't mean that all I've explained so far isn't still relevant. That method still gives you the opportunity to have multiple colors for just one icon. And since it is in text format, you can also store it in the data source to relate it to a particular record. For example, category A has this icon, category B has this icon, and so on. So anyway, let's get back into our video. Now that we are done with our preliminary work, it's time to cook. First, we need to lay out our page. Look into our design, you see that we have 4 sections, one for the header, next for the product categories, next for the inventory, and lastly, the mobile menu bar. We are going to add a non-responsive container for each section. If you are building a responsive app, you would use the responsive containers instead. But for this video, we are keeping things simple. Once we've added them, we set the height of each to be as desired. Once we've done that, we also need to rename each of the containers to help us while formatting it later. Next, we add a background image to our home screen. Make sure you set the fill to a color similar to your image. This is because images sometimes take a few seconds to load. This will preserve your app's look even while the image is loading.
Whoa. Nah, I never knew that.
Next, we begin adding in our controls. We start with the header. Since the header is something you will use on multiple pages, it is smarter to build it as a reusable component that will have one point of edits. So we go to our components tab and create a new component and name it header component. Next thing, we resize it so the width is the same as the max width of our app and set the height to our desired height. In our case, the height is 80. So if you are building a mobile app, the max width is about 640. But if you are building a wide app, which is the tablet form factor, the width will be about 1366. So next, we add in a horizontal responsive container. Make sure it fills the component by setting the width and height to that of the parent. So the reason why we are using the responsive container is because we want to leverage its padding functionality. So here we set our desired padding. In our case, we are going to set 30 on the left and 30 on the right. Next, we add our logo. So this is an image control. Make sure the flexible width is off and then set your desired height. Set the height to fill the container by using stretch and set the min height to 0. Next, we create a component property to store the logo. Once we've done that, we can then use this component property inside of the image control. So you do that by saying header component dot header logo. So depending on what name you give your component and your property, that is what you put inside of the image control. You can then set the default value for your property. In our case, we just select the logo that we uploaded earlier. Once that is done, we need to resize the image control to be as desired. First, you make sure that the flexible width is set to off, and then you can reduce the width as needed. For us, we are just going to leave it at 150 for now. We can change that whenever. Next, we add another horizontal container inside of our parent container. This is for our other navbar items. You set the alignment to stretch, the min height to 0, and now we can add in our items. First is the user image. So we add an image control and resize it accordingly. We then set the alignment to center. You make sure the height takes 60% of the parent height, and lastly, turn off the flexible width. Also, set the width to be the same as the height so you can make it a square. Next, we make sure that the border radius is greater than half of the width of the control, so we set that to 50. Lastly, we set the image property to user.image. Let's also give it a border color of white and set the border thickness to 2. Since we are building a mobile app, this much is enough for us. But if you are building a tablet or a web power app, you have more space to add more components. In our last video, we added a label for the name and another icon. To do that, you add in the text label, reorder it, resize it as needed. I usually set the height to stretch and the minimum height to 0, and then I turn off the flexible width and set the width to be as desired. Next, you do some formatting on the text however you want it to be displayed. Once you're fine with how it looks, you can also optionally add in a separator between your components. I usually use the rectangle control for this. So you add in the rectangle control, set the width to about 2, set the height to about 80% of the parent height, and make sure the alignment is set to center. Then we can copy paste our existing label, reorder it to be at the starting point, and I will change the text. To help, you can set the width to be as desired. Lastly, let's add in an image control for our icon. We reorder its position, turn off the flexible width, set its width and height to 30, and make sure it is vertically centered inside of our container. And lastly, all we need to do is add in our icon data. You can do that directly within the component or set a custom property for it so that it can be controlled from outside the component. This is because you might have a situation where you want to make the icon have different colors for different pages. So here we just create a custom property. I'll call it help icon. We set the data type to image, and then on the image we set its image property to the header component dot help icon. So that will get whatever image we add into that component. Next, we can set the gap of the component to 10. So this spaces out our controls within that container. You can then add whatever function you need to the onSelect property. If you want it to navigate to a screen, you create a screen property and add it. So lastly, we'd add the component to our home screen. All we need to do is to set for the name, or just go to the custom section, and then we select our header components, and then in the help icon we paste the code for our icon. If you don't understand this part, please go back to the chapter on SVG Management. As I've said before, this part isn't needed since we are building a mobile app, so we are just going to delete all of the other controls apart from the user image. Next, let's give it a 20 pixel space from the top. I usually do that when I'm developing responsive mobile apps. This is to make sure part of the app is not cut off by the phone's notch. And with that, the mobile header is done. So let's move to the next section.
Nice.
Looking back to our design, you notice that this first section has a padding of 30 on both sides. So you can add in your components, or controls rather, and position them manually. But what I mostly do is that I leverage the padding functionality of responsive containers. So you add in a horizontal responsive container, make sure the width is that of the parent, and set the height to be as desired. Next, you set the left and right padding to be as desired. In our case, we are setting them both to 30. So next, inside of this container, add in a non-responsive container. You make sure the flexible width is turned on, and set the minimum width to 0, set the minimum height to 0, and set the height alignment to stretch. And now, if you add in any controls inside of that container, you notice that you can move it around however you want, but it doesn't get into the padding that you've set. Next, we add in 2 text labels inside of our container, and you resize them and change the text as needed. We then format the look of each of them. So make sure to always set a distinction between your headers and subheaders. You can use different colors, different font weights, different font styles, and so on. So let's also rename our container so they can be more descriptive. And now that's done, let's add in our custom button. First, we add in a non-responsive container. we set the height to be 65% of the parent height and make sure it is vertically aligned in the center by setting the Y property to this formula. Let's just add a new field to help us while formatting the size. Next, we set the height to be as needed and position it horizontally towards the end of the parent container. So next, let's remove our fill. We also want to add in a border thickness of 2, set the border color to white, and then we are going to add in a border radius and border shadow. The border radius is going to be 15, and for now, let's set the drop shadow to regular. And if we play it, you can see the drop shadow effect. Next, we add in a text label. We set the width and height to be that of the parent. And let's do some general formatting. So we set the font size to 15, set the text, set the text alignment to center, set the weight to semi-bold, set the color to white. And lastly, let's add in an image control for our icon. So we set the height and width to 25 and make sure it is vertically aligned by setting the Y property to this formula, and make sure you also position it towards the end of the container. Next, we increase the right padding on our label so we can see the full text. And lastly, let's add in our icon data. So if you don't understand this part, please go back to the section on SVG Management. So now all our visual components are done. The next thing is to make the button clickable. So first, we add in a button control. So we set the width and the height to be that of the parent. You clear the text, set the fill to be transparent, set the border style to none, and then set the hover color to a very light black. So to do that, you just add in RGBA 000 and 0.1. The last part is the opacity control. And then for the fill, for the pressed fill, you want to add in the same code, but you can increase the opacity to 0.3 or 0.2. And then you can put in any actions for the button inside of the onSelect property. In our case, we're just going to leave it blank for now. Next, we add in our gallery. So since we want this to have an effect of scrolling into the screen, we are not going to set any padding. So we add in a non-responsive container, resize it as needed, and then we add our gallery control. So the gallery control we are going to use is the horizontal gallery. So we set the height to be that of the parent. We change the template size to be 75% of the screen's width. And we set the X property to 30 and set the width to parent the width minus 30. So looking back to our design, you notice that the gallery has 2 base sections, with the first section also has 3 different sections. So next, we add in a horizontal responsive container. We set the width and height to the parent's template width and parent's template height, and make sure the X and Y values are set to 0. Next, we delete all of the other controls since we are not using them. Next, let's set the fill property of the container to white and set the opacity to 50%. To do that, just make sure that the last parameter is 0.5. Next, let's increase the template padding to 15 and let's add in our data source. So next, we turn off the scroll bar since this will be a mobile app. But if you're developing a web app, you might need to leave the scroll bar there. So once that all of that is done, we set the border radius to 25 and set the drop shadow to regular, and that gives it a nice pop-up or card effect. Next, let's add in 2 non-responsive containers. So if you notice your containers are showing up outside of the print container, just make sure you toggle off and on the flexible width, and then it will be aligned inside of the container properly. So that is just a PowerApps Studio bug. Hopefully it will be fixed in the next patch.
Absolutely not.
So next, let's set the minimum width of both items to 50. And we want the right container to take up 1/3 of the total container. So we set the fill portion to 1 and set the other one to 2. So next, let's change the fill property of our right container to be a transparent purple. So now we can begin adding our controls. So starting from the left side, we add in a non-responsive container. We resize it as needed, add in 2 text labels, one for the category name and the other for the product count. So we then format both of them as needed and we give them both a left padding of 30. Now we are done with line 1. Let's go to the second line. Next, let's rename all of our containers to be more descriptive. So we copy paste our first line and rename it to line 2. And let's delete one of the labels and then set the text of the second label to the full name of the category manager. Next, you make sure it fills up the height of the parent container. And next, you want to add in the image of the category manager. So for that, let's first add in a non-responsive container. We set the height and width to 40 and make sure it is 30 pixels away from the end of the parent container by setting in its X property to this formula, parent the width minus self the width minus 30. Next, make sure it is vertically aligned inside of the container by setting the Y property to parent the height minus self the height divided by 2. Next, let's add in an image control. Make sure it fills the container by setting the width and height to that of the parent. So next, we add in a border thickness of 2 to the container. We set the border color to white and set the border radius to 40 so it can be circular. Next, in the image property of the image control, we paste this code here. So this code checks if the current user has a profile photo. So if they do, it displays the photo, else it remains blank. So make sure you've added the Office 365 users connection in your app for this to work. Next, we want it to display the user's initials if they do not have a profile image. So to do that, let's add in a label. We set the width and height to be that of the parent, and let's change the text to 2 letters for now. And then we change the color, or better still, just our primary color. Next, let's add in this code to the text property. So this code takes the first letter of the user's name, of the user's first name, and the first letter of the user's last name. So next, we only want this label to be visible if the user doesn't have a photo. So we copy our original condition from our image control and then invert it inside of our label. So you can just add in the exclamation mark or use the not function. Both of them work either way. And you can then see the label is only visible for users that don't have a profile image. Next, let's resize the label. First, we set the width to the X property of our image container, so it ends wherever that container starts. And we need to change the alignment to right. So we also want some separators between each of the lines. So we add in, we add the rectangle for this. We set the width to 95% of the parent width. We set the height to 2. And since we want it to be aligned to the right of the container, we set the X property to parent the width minus self the width. And next, we copy paste this rectangle and put it at the bottom of the container. So we set the Y property to parent the height minus self the height. Next, let's copy paste line 1, rename it to line 3, and reposition it as needed. So first, we will delete one of the labels, and then let's reposition the other label to fill the height of the container. We change the text property and reformat as needed. So next, we resize it to create space for our icon. So once that is done, we add in our image control, set its width and height to 25, align it vertically inside of our container, we set the X property to 30, and then let's add in our icon data. So if you don't understand this part, please go to the section on SVG Management. So next, let's start work on the right side of our container. So we are going to add in a circular progress bar here. So first, we add in a non-responsive container. We set its width to 80% of the parent's width, and then set the height to be the same as the width. Next, we position it in the center of the container by setting the X and Y properties. Once that is done, we add in an image control. Make sure it fills the width and height of the container. So then we add in our data to render the progress bar. So if you don't understand what is going on here, I explained it in details and provided the code for this in our gallery designs video. So I'll link it up here and you can check it out. But in summary, all we are doing is rendering an SVG, and I've done it in a way where you can provide the exact progress values and the rendering colors for the components. In our case, the progress value is the average rating of this category, the average price rating of this category. The base circle color is light gray, and the value circle color changes depending on the rating. So if it's less than 40, it will be reddish. If it's between 40 and 70, it will be yellow. And if it is above that, it's green. So next, we just render it how we would render a normal SVG. Next, you want to add in a text label that shows the actual percentage of the average rating. We set the width and height to that of the parent, and then set the text value to be the average rating percentage, and then we can reformat the colors and styles as needed. So let's also change the right containers to take up only 30% of the full width of the parent size. So rather than it taking 1/3. So to do that, let's change the fill portion to 3 and set that of the left container to 7. So you will notice that the positioning of some of our controls have been deformed. And this is why I mostly advise you mathematically position and size your controls inside your app. So let's select the image control of the circular progress bar and set the width and height to parent the width and parent the height. So now that is done, let's add in a separator between the navbar container and section 2. So to do this, just add in a rectangle, set the width to be about 95% of the width of the parent, and set the height to about 4. So that be like 4 pixel thickness, and make sure it is positioned in the center horizontally, and we vertically position it at the bottom. So next we set the color to white and give it a 50% opacity, and that looks clean.
Yeah, boy.
So let's also add a little bit of space between the navbar and the navbar container and section 2, and yeah, that looks much better. Next, let's add in our filter. So we sort it based on the product average rating and use the first n functions to pick only the top 4. And next, we want this to also be clickable. So let's add in a button inside of our gallery but outside of the container. Make sure the button fills in the gallery's template width and template height, and then make sure the button is transparent. We also remove the text, set the border to none, and similar to what we did for our custom buttons, we set the hover fill to a black with 10% opacity, and set the press fill to be the same but with about 30% opacity. And lastly, let's make sure the border radius is the same as that of our containers. And now let's test it out. So on click of the button, you can set whatever code of functionality you need to be. For us, we're just going to keep it to select the parent.
Okay.
And now to the third section. First of all, let's make the background white, and then let's add in some border radius on the top left and top right. So 30 should be okay for now. So let's copy the category header from our second section and paste that in our third section, since they have the same look. So let's just rename the container and change the text. So the text of the subheader depends on the selected category in the first section. So if no category is selected, we just want it to display the top 10 products. But if a category is selected, we want it to show the top 10 products inside of that category. Now let's increase the height of the container. As you can see, the header and the subheader are overlaying the button on the right. So let's make sure that both of them stop where the button starts. So we set the width for both labels to be custom btn_1.x. So now let's change the coloring of the custom button. So first, we change the border color of the container to our primary color, and then we can also change the label and icon color to be our primary color. Next, let's add in our gallery. We'll add in a vertical gallery and select our data source, and then we want it to start where our section header stop. So we set the y value to the y value of our section header plus the height of our section header. Next, we set our width to parent the width minus 60, so we can have 30 padding on both sides. So we set our x value to 30. Lastly, we want the height to take up the remaining space of the container, so we just set it to parent the height minus self the y. Looking to our original design, you see we have two sections side by side, and in the first section we also have two sections stacked on top of each other. Now we are going to add in the layout for this design. First, we add in a responsive horizontal container, and make sure it fills the gallery template by setting the width and height to the template width and template height of our gallery. Then we add in two non-responsive containers for the left and the right section. If you notice one of your containers is outside of the canvas, just toggle the flexible width on and off so it will realign properly. Next, let's set the minimum width for both of them to 50. And then since we want the right side to take up 40%, let's set the portion to 3, the fill portion to 3. And since we want the right side to take up 40%, let's set the portion to 3.
I'm out, man. That nigga's tripping.
And then we set the fill portion of the left side to 7. Now this part is optional, but if you look at our design, you notice that the gallery lines seem to stack on top of each other. And for this, we will need a separate container to replicate this effect. So back to our gallery, let's add in a non-responsive container this time. Make sure the width fills the template width of our gallery. And then for the height, we set the height to template height, to the gallery's template height plus 20. And next, let's add in a border to the container. So we set the border thickness to 2, and then let's set the border, let's add in a border radius. So we want the top left border and top right border to be 20. Then let's change the fill color of the container to white. And then depending on the intensity of the stacking effect, you set a drop shadow. So we are going to set it on semi-bold for now, but if you want it to be more pronounced, you can set a higher level of the drop shadow. Now you notice some of the border is being cut off outside of the gallery, so let's reduce the width of the container by 4 and then set the X property to 2, so we have enough space for the border on the left and on the right, which corresponds to our border thickness. So since this is a mobile app we are building, we are going to turn off the scroll bar, but if you are building a web app, you might want to leave the scroll bar on. So next, let's move in our responsive container into our stacking container. So we cut and paste it. Make sure it fills in the gallery's template size and not the parent container's size. So let's change the height and width respectively. Now let's change the template size of the gallery to 100. And also set the mean height of our left and right containers to 0. Starting from our left section, we add in a non-responsive container for the first line, and then add in 2 labels inside of that container. We then format the look of the text labels by changing the font size, font weight, and color. Once that is done, let's copy the whole of line 1 and paste it. First, let's remove the items inside of our container. And then for this second line, we are going to add in an horizontal progress bar. So I did a tutorial on how to do this step by step. So check that out if you haven't already. On the right side, we are going to add in a text fill. So this is similar to what I did in the gallery designs video. However, instead of using a button for the rounded background, I now used a container, but everything else stays the same. So check that out if you haven't. So let's also rename our containers to be more descriptive. And lastly, let's add in the filter logic to the gallery and let's test it out.
A great success!
Now moving to our last section. For the menu bar container, let's set the fill color to white. You also want to put some separator between the third section and the menu bar section. So let's add in a rectangle, set the height to 2, set the width to be the parent width, and we set the color to a light gray. So let's also give it a drop shadow because we want to give the floating gallery the effect of calling it from inside of the screen. So the higher the drop shadow, the more the overlaying effect. So we set the drop shadow of the menu bar container to extra bold. Let's also change the drop shadow of the floating gallery to extra bold. Now the layout of the section is done, let's add in the actual menu bar. So this part is actually very easy. To do this, all you need to do is to click on the insert button and search super cool menu bar and add in the menu control. And that is all. So let's move to the next page.
What is this? What is this?
I'm joking. So that is actually a custom component. So I will teach you how to create this step by step.
You naughty, you teasing me, you naughty.
Before that, if you've at least learned something in this video, please hit the subscribe button and like the video. Thanks. So let's first delete the previous component and let's create a new one. We set the name as menu bar. So let's set the height to our desired height. So for us, let's set it to 70. Next, we add in a horizontal gallery. Let's set the data source to an array of 4 items for now. And then we make sure the gallery fills the entire component. So we set the width and height to that of the parent. Next, let's change the template size to self the width divided by 4. This is to make sure that each menu item will have the same size. It is static for now, but we'll change it to be dynamic later. So depending on the number of menu items in the gallery, that will determine how many menu items inside of the control. Now, inside of the gallery, let's add in a non-responsive container and delete every other control. So next, you want to make sure that the container fills in the gallery's template size. So we set the width and height to the parent's template width and the template height respectively. So the next step is optional, but if you want there to be some left and right padding, you can set the X property and then set the width of your gallery. In our case, you set the X property to 30 and set the width of the gallery to parent the width minus 60. So that will give 30 on each side. So that's where I got the 60 from. So if your left side was 20, you would subtract 40. So that'll be 20 on both sides. Anyway, so now let's add in our image control that will display our menu icons. So we set the width and height to be that of the parent. And since we want this to be fully customizable from the app screen, we are going to control the menu bar content with a components property. So another advantage of this method is that you can import this component into any of your other apps, and then you won't need to make changes to the component itself. Just modify the component property, which is the data coming into the component, and then your menu update based on that. So let's add in a new custom property. We'll call it menu data and set the data type to table. So next, for the gallery, we are going to connect it to that property. So we set the data source to menu bar.menu data. So menu bar is the name of the component. Menu data is the name of the property. So that's the format of the property. So next, let's customize the schema of the custom property. So each record will have 4 columns. So the first one is the menu name. This will be for menu designs where you want to display the name. The next one is the menu ID. The menu ID is just a simple number column that we use to track the ID of the current selected menu item. Then the next one, page navigation. This is to store the screen that you want to navigate to anytime a menu item is clicked. Right. And the last one is the menu icon. So this will be the icon that you want to display on the menu item. So the reason why we are using text for that is because we are going to be using custom SVG icons. But if you want to use like system icons, you will just need to initialize an icon inside of that column. So you can just put any of the available icons like icon.home, icon.trash, and yeah, any of those, and that would initialize an icon variable. For the menu icon, let's just go ahead and copy one of our initialized SVGs from our app. Next, let's copy and paste this about 4 times to represent the 4 different menu items, and let's just also change the menu IDs. Next, we add in our icons to the gallery, but in place of the SVG text, we just use this item dot menu icon, and then we add in some top and bottom padding. Next, we need an indication bar at the top of our icon. So we add in, it's optional, but so we add in a rectangle. We set the height to 4 and make the width about 60% of the container, and then we center it using our trusty formula. The idea here is that we want each menu icon and indicator to have a different base color and then a different color when it is selected. So let's add in a few custom properties for each color. And since we are dealing with SVGs, we also need to add in text versions of the color. So now that is done, let's set the values. We want the base color. Let's set the default values. So we want the base color to be light gray, and we want the selected color to be blue. All right, so let's add in another property to track the current selected menu item. So next, we want the indicator to only be visible when it is active. So to do that, we set the visible property to this formula. It checks if the menu ID of the indicator is equal to the current ID of the component. So if you change the default value to 3, you notice the third menu is now active. And if we change it back, you see it goes back to the first one. So next, let's set the colors. So starting from the icon, we use this formula to substitute the colors. It checks if the menu ID equals the component's current menu ID. So if it does, it sets the color to use selected icon color, which is blue. Else, it sets it to our base icon color, which is gray. And let's do the same thing for our indicator. So since it is not an SVG icon, we can directly edit the field property and add in any conditions if need be. Also, if you want to add menu names, all you need to do is to add in the text label, reposition it as needed, and then set the text to this item the menu name. But since we aren't using that, I'll just go ahead and delete that for now. Or delete that since we're not using it. Anyway, so yeah, now the visuals are done. Let's add in functionality. We add in a button, make sure it is first in the gallery, we clear the text, make the field transparent, and then let's set the border radius to 0. Let's also set the hover fill to a very transparent black and do the same thing for the pressed fill, and that looks clean. Next, we set the onSelect to navigate to this item dot page navigation, and depending on whatever is in the menu data, to navigate to that page. So now let's add the menu to our screen. So once we've added it, make sure it fills the container. We set it to set the width and height. And once it is added, let's set our selected icon property to our primary color. Then let's configure the menu data property. We go to the onStart property of our app and add this code. So this creates a collection, custom navigation, and it is based on the schema that we set inside of our menu components. So you see the menu names, the ID, the page navigations, which is still just screen 1 for now, as we only have one screen currently, but we'll change that later. And then finally, the icons, which we reference from our custom icon selection. So don't forget to run onStart to get the latest changes. So now, all that's left to do is to add this collection to our components. And then you notice the change immediately. So let's duplicate this screen to test out the navigation functionality. So we rename this page. Let's delete the content and let's set the background to white. Next, let's set the current menu ID to 2. So the second menu item will be the one that will be highlighted on this page. And then finally, let's change the page navigation of menu item 2 to product page. And let's test that out. Nice. And yeah, one more thing. If you want the menu bar item width to be dynamic based on the menu data, you need to edit the template size. So instead of dividing by 4, just provide the number of items, just divide it by the number of items in the menu data property. And if we delete the last item in menu data, you will notice that the menu bar items have been repositioned accordingly. So this will help a lot if you are building responsive apps. Cool. So now let's build the product page. So for the product page, let's first change the background from a white to a light gray. And then we set the navbar container background to white. So this is just to give it a bit of contrast between the sections. So next, let's also change the divider from white to a dark gray. Let's set the height to 2 and make sure it fills the parent width. So if you jump to this section and you want to know how I created the navbar, just go back to the section on the header component. So next, let's add in a new non-responsive container and make sure it fills the parent width. Then we can just copy the category header from our homepage. Let's delete the subheader and make sure the header fills the height of the parent. Next, let's resize and reposition the label and the button container as needed. Then we set the background color of our custom button container to our primary color, which is blue. And then let's also reposition the icon as needed and also change the icon. Next, let's change the text also. You might also need to increase or decrease the label padding to fit your needs. And for those building responsive apps, just use a responsive container. Now, the header section is done. Let's move to the filter section. First, let's add in a horizontal responsive container and resize as needed. In the gallery designs video, we left the container transparent, but now let's make the background white just for some contrast. All that's left now is to add the filter controls. So let's start from the search bar. First, let's add in a non-responsive container. We set the alignments to stretch and set the min height to 0. Let's also set the min width to 200 for now. And then we insert a text input control. We set the width and the height to fill the parent and make sure the X and Y property is set to 0. Let's also set the border radius to 0 and the border style to none. And let's clear the default value and add in hint text. We can also reduce the font size as needed. Next, we want to add a line under the text input. So to do that, let's just get a rectangle control. We set the height to 1 and set the width to fill the parent. We also set X to 0 and Y to parent the height minus L the height. This will make sure the line will be at the bottom of the container. Next, we want to add in a search icon. So we add in our image control, make sure the height fills the height of the parent, and then set the width to about 30. Then we add the SVG data for our icon. So the idea here is that we want the icon to show if there is no text, but once the user starts typing in the control, the icon should be cleared. So first, we make the text input padding dynamic by adding this code. So if the input is blank, we set the padding to 12, else we set it to 5 plus icon width. So then we also make sure the icon is only visible when the text is blank. And let's do that by adding this formula. So let's test that out. Cool. Next, let's give the main filter container a top and bottom padding of 10. So just so everything is well spaced. Then before we add in our next filter control, let's add in a separator. To do that, let's use the rectangle control and set the height alignment to stretch, set the min height to 0, and let's set the width to 1. Then let's also add 15 pixel gap on the main filter container. So this will make sure that every item inside of that respective container will have a space of at least 15 pixels between each other. You can also change the hover fill and press fill of the text input to match your app. I'm just going to use a light gray. The next filter component we'll add is a combo box. So we set the items, we set the height alignment to stretch, we set the min height to 0, we set the min width to 200 for now. And next, let's just style it to fit our app. So first, we set the border style to none, we set the font size to 15. Let's also change the chevron background to transparent, and let's set the chevron fill to our secondary color. Let's also change the text placeholder. And with that, we are done with the filter container. You can add as many filter controls as needed, but in our case, we are just going to use just these two since it's a mobile app and there is not much space here. All right, so let's move on to our gallery. Then moving on to the gallery, let's add in a non-responsive container for the section. Let's resize it. We set the background color to white and add a 30 pixel border radius on the top left and top right. Let's also add an extra bold drop shadow. Lastly, let's duplicate this page as the third page will have a similar structure. So let's do some text changes and let's update the menu components to reflect the current page. We also need to update the page navigation in the apps on start property. Next, I'm just going to copy and paste our gallery from our gallery designs video and the one from the homepage of this app. So if you want to see how I built the products gallery, just check out the video. I did everything step by step and you can follow that. And the only update now is that I use containers with border radius for rounded backgrounds instead of buttons. So that's an update. And yeah, cool. So we also need to add in navigation functionality to our homepage buttons. So let's add that. And we'll also use a screen transition because why not? And yeah, let's test the outer. So we all have shared in this video, you should now be able to create modern UIs in your PowerApps instead of all those boxy PowerApps.
Let's be nice. We don't have to go there. I mean, you're not wrong, but you didn't have to say it. I mean,
this should give you more ideas on how to build your PowerApps. So if you found this content helpful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, bye.